Hi, my name is Dane Christensen and I'm a documentary filmmaker in Salt Lake City, Utah. I use the Ronin 4D as my main camera when I'm making my films, and I have a lot of reasons for that. But the main one is I love the creative flexibility that this entire camera system offers when I'm out on set. It's unparalleled. There is a big question that I have with this camera system, and that's what kind of lenses are actually compatible. DJI has published a list of official compatible lenses, but I'm here at Pictureline today to test which lenses beyond that list work or don't work with the Ronin 4D. I'm going to test Sony, Sigma, Canon, and even Tamron. So with that said, let's get started.
I'll be using a grading system to evaluate how well each lens balances on the Ronin 4D. An A grade means that the lens balances without issue and has flawless stabilization. A B grade means that the lens is well within the motor tolerance, but doesn't balance perfectly. However, the lens stabilizes just fine. A C grade means that the lens balances poorly and has mediocre stabilization, and you'll need to be careful with your movements to get usable footage. An F grade means that the lens won't balance safely on the gimbal, and you shouldn't use it. On DJI's website it says that the 17-28 and the 28-75mm lenses are both supported on the Ronin 4D. So what I'm testing here is its sibling lens, the telephoto 70-180mm f2.8. It's a very lightweight telephoto lens in comparison to other telephoto lenses from other camera brands. It's a good candidate for the Ronin 4D. The lens is long and heavy and doesn't have a perfect balance on the gimbal. However, it stabilizes just fine. You just have to be a little careful with your movements so you don't get any shake in your footage. And here's a note about using zoom lenses on the Ronin 4D. You can use any zoom lens on the Ronin 4D, however, in order to have autofocus, both with the LiDAR system and using the focus wheel, you need to calibrate each focal length that you'd like to use on that zoom lens. So, for example, on this 70-180mm lens, I calibrated the 70mm, 100mm, 135mm, and 180mm focal lengths. I could calibrate any focal length on a zoom lens, but I chose those four simply for convenience. And in use, you simply switch between those lens calibration profiles in the menu system. It's quite easy and only takes a second. If you weren't to calibrate the focal length you're using on a zoom lens, the focus wheel would still pull focus, but it would feel like it's broken and inconsistent. So it's important that when you zoom on a zoom lens, that you have the right lens calibration profile activated. The next lens we're going to test is the Sony 24-70 G Master Mark I. Despite this being a very heavy zoom lens, the Ronin 4D was able to balance it just fine, and it was even able to stabilize in the Z-axis. It only became a problem later on when you zoom into 70mm. That's when the balance didn't hold up quite very well, and you have to be very careful when setting down the Ronin. Since this is a native E-mount lens, the Ronin 4D software supports it, and you can auto-calibrate each focal length without issue. If you already have this lens in your kit, I think it is a good fit for the Ronin 4D. The new Sony 24-70 G Master Mark II is significantly lighter than its Mark I predecessor. And as expected, it balances great on the Ronin 4D and stabilizes very well. The lens even performs very well when fully zoomed into 70mm. The Ronin 4D is able to handle it with no problem. Next, let's test the Sigma 105mm macro lens for E-mount. The lens balances and stabilizes flawlessly, and even works with auto calibration for the autofocus. The Sony 90mm macro lens, unsurprisingly, also balances, stabilizes, and auto calibrates flawlessly. Having a macro lens on a gimbal like this is quite useful because you can use it to make precise movements and focus pulls. Moving over to the Canon EF mount lenses, things become a little less reliable. The Canon 100mm macro lens, while it balances great, doesn't have software support on the Ronin 4D. You have no iris control, and if you wanted to focus the lens, you'd have to use the external motor. Since there is no physical aperture ring on the lens itself, your only option is to be able to change it on the Ronin 4D screen, but since there's no software support for this lens, you can't change the iris on the screen either. I can't recommend using this lens on the Ronin 4D. Now the Canon 24-70mm f2.8 is a bit of a different story. It does fit on the Ronin 4D and it will balance, but very poorly, and you need to be careful with your movements in order to not add shake to your footage. Once the gimbal motors are engaged, it will handle the lens just fine. You just need to be careful when setting down the Ronin and picking it up again. As for software support, you do have iris control with this lens. However, there is no autofocus support. You will need to use the external focus motor and manual calibration in order to use the focus wheel with this lens. Attaching the external focus motor will actually help with balancing this lens on the gimbal. I would say if you have this lens already in your kit, go ahead and use it on the Ronin 4D. The Canon 16-35mm f2.8 lens is in the same situation as the 24-70. It balances poorly, but it stabilizes fine if you're careful with your camera movements. As for software support, you have your iris control, but you need to use an external focus motor in order to pull focus. Next, the Canon 14mm f2.8 lens balances great, stabilizes great on the Ronin 4D. However, in the software you have no iris control and no focus control, which is unfortunate because a 14mm lens on a gimbal is a really dynamic perspective. And the Canon 24mm f1.4 lens is in the same situation. Balances great, stabilizes great, but no iris control and no internal focus control. I can't recommend using this lens on the Ronin 4D. Now when testing the Canon 35mm f1.4 lens, things were a little different. It balanced great, stabilized great, and like the other Canon EF lenses, no iris control. However, I was getting this black screen error when connecting this lens to the Ronin 4D. Every time I put this lens on the Ronin 4D, I would lose picture on my screen. It's a really odd error, and it makes me think that with a software update from DJI, a lot of these Canon EF lenses would work great. The Canon 50mm f1.2 was the real winner of the Canon EF lenses. Not only does it balance and stabilize phenomenally, it has full software support on the Ronin 4D. You have iris control and you can auto-calibrate the autofocus with this lens. This is a great lens and a great focal length to have on the Ronin 4D. Unfortunately, the Canon 50mm f1.2 lens is the only lens out of the Canon EF lenses that works seamlessly with the Ronin 4D. The Canon 85mm f1.4, while it does balance alright, has no iris control and you have to use an external focus motor. I also tested the Sigma 35mm f1.4 and the 50mm f1.4 EF mount lenses, and they both have that black screen error on the Ronin 4D, where when you mount the lens on the gimbal, you lose the picture on the camera screen. It's a really odd error, and I hope it gets fixed with a software update. It's worth mentioning that manual lenses work actually really well on the Ronin 4D, because you don't have any of the software issues to stand in the way. For example, I tried these SLR Magic APO Microprimes lenses, and while they're very heavy, they were able to balance okay and stabilize just fine. And when I added the external focus motor, these manual lenses became autofocus enabled. I was able to balance and stabilize the 25, 32, 50, and 85mm lenses.
Alright, so after testing all those lenses, I'm actually really surprised and happy with how many of the lenses would balance on the 3 axes and even with the Z axis. However, I was disappointed with the amount of the Canon EF lenses that would balance on the gimbal but wouldn't communicate with the Ronin 4D software. And I really hope that there is a software update coming down the road that will enable these EF lenses to work on the Ronin 4D, because they will mount, they will balance, and they're really great lenses, and I know that a lot of you have a ton of these EF lenses lying around, and it would be great to be able to use them on this camera system. One of the surprising takeaways here is this Tamron 70-180 telephoto lens balanced on the Ronin 4D. This was the longest lens that I tried when it was fully extended. While it didn't balance perfectly, it was within the tolerance of the gimbal motors to keep it stable. I'm really excited to be able to have this telephoto lens on a gimbal in my kit. This was our experiment testing lenses on the Ronin 4D. If you have any other questions about this camera system or want to see us test more lenses on it, drop us a comment and make sure to hit that subscribe button.